A 46,000-year-old skeleton discovered inside an ancient cave shocked archaeologists completely. The skeleton belonged to a severely disabled prehistoric man surviving impossibly long. He had a withered arm and one missing hand entirely already. He was also blind in one eye for years, surviving somehow. By survival standards, ancient humans believed weak individuals should quickly die naturally. But this man survived many years despite impossible physical limitations and weakness. Someone fed him, protected him, and cared for him daily throughout life. That discovery completely changed assumptions about prehistoric human cruelty and survival instincts. Ancient humans were apparently far more compassionate than previously believed by scientists worldwide. But another disturbing question suddenly emerged from this incredible archaeological discovery afterward. What happened to ancient humans suffering severe mental illnesses throughout prehistoric history exactly? Modern society assumes ancient humans abandoned anyone unable to contribute productively during survival. People imagine prehistoric survival required brutal efficiency, without compassion or emotional attachment whatsoever. The strongest survived, while the weakest supposedly disappeared from human history completely forever. But archaeology repeatedly reveals a much more compassionate prehistoric human reality instead. Ancient communities repeatedly protected vulnerable members, despite enormous survival risks and hardships together. Mental illness existed long before smartphones, cities, or modern stressful lifestyles appeared historically. The human brain has always carried possibilities for psychological suffering and disorders internally. Depression, psychosis, mania, and schizophrenia existed throughout ancient human history, already before civilization. The same brain-enabling civilization can also create terrifying psychological experiences and confusions. Schizophrenia affects roughly 1% of humans across every culture studied scientifically worldwide. That means ancient campfires likely included mentally ill individuals within tribal communities regularly. Some ancient humans probably heard voices nobody else could hear around them daily. Others likely experienced visions disconnected from the reality shared by everyone nearby together. For decades, scientists assumed mentally ill ancient humans were abandoned immediately by their tribes. The theory sounded logical, cold, efficient, and perfectly suited for prehistoric survival hardships. But archaeological evidence repeatedly contradicted those assumptions, with surprisingly compassionate discoveries worldwide. Researchers discovered mentally impaired prehistoric individuals surviving far longer than expected repeatedly throughout history. One ancient woman from Morocco suffered severe intellectual disabilities during prehistoric adulthood survival. Her condition made independent survival nearly impossible in dangerous prehistoric environments and conditions. Yet she survived into adulthood because others continuously cared for her compassionately throughout life. Someone fed her, protected her, and kept her alive despite enormous survival costs. Another shocking case emerged from Atapuerca in Spain 430,000 years ago archaeologically. Researchers found remains of a child with serious developmental abnormalities and neurological disorders. The condition would have been obvious to everyone within the prehistoric community immediately. Still, the child survived far beyond expectations because others continuously provided care and support. These discoveries are not isolated accidents, but repeated patterns throughout human archaeological history. Communities repeatedly chose compassion over ruthless survival efficiency throughout prehistoric civilization and evolution. The oldest known evidence of humanity may actually be compassion toward vulnerable individuals entirely. But mental illness frightened ancient humans differently than physical disabilities usually did psychologically. Physical injuries remained understandable, while mental disorders seemed mysterious and deeply terrifying to communities. Voices, hallucinations, and strange behaviors felt impossible for ancient humans to explain logically. Ancient cultures usually interpreted mental illness as supernatural, rather than medical conditions historically throughout civilizations. People behaving differently were believed connected to powerful, unseen spiritual forces beyond reality entirely. The voices mentally ill individuals heard were considered meaningful supernatural messages from spirits often. Visions and hallucinations became interpreted as sacred communication from another world entirely sometimes. Ancient humans often believed mentally unusual individuals possessed spiritual gifts or supernatural connections instead. Some mentally ill individuals eventually became shamans within prehistoric tribal communities across continents historically. Shamans supposedly communicated between ordinary humans and invisible spiritual worlds beyond reality regularly. Behaviors modern psychiatry calls symptoms were once interpreted as sacred supernatural abilities, instead, universally. The concept of the shaman appeared across nearly every ancient human civilization independently worldwide. Shamans stood between ordinary reality and mysterious unseen spiritual dimensions believed by tribes. They communicated with spirits, ancestors, gods, and forces beyond normal human understanding, supposedly. Anthropologists noticed shamans displayed behaviors resembling modern psychiatric symptoms surprisingly often throughout history. Hearing voices and experiencing visions were considered sacred gifts instead of illnesses historically. Modern psychiatry labels these experiences symptoms requiring diagnosis and clinical treatment today medically. Ancient cultures instead gave those experiences meaning, purpose, and respected spiritual importance within society. That cultural interpretation may have dramatically changed how mental illness felt internally psychologically. Researchers discovered culture influences how psychosis is experienced emotionally and mentally worldwide profoundly. A major schizophrenia study compared experiences across Ghana, Vietnam, and the United States internationally. Many participants from Ghana described voices as familiar and occasionally comforting emotionally during psychosis. Some believed ancestors or spiritual beings were communicating meaningful guidance through the voices directly. In Vietnam, psychosis was also often interpreted through spiritual or ancestral frameworks culturally. But American participants mostly described terrifying, hostile, and meaningless auditory hallucinations psychologically during interviews. The illness remained biologically similar, while cultural interpretation completely changed emotional experiences internally. The stories societies tell about madness shape how sufferers experience their conditions profoundly. Ancient cultures often frame suffering as meaningful, rather than random or hopeless psychologically for individuals. That sense of purpose may have protected mentally ill individuals emotionally from despair sometimes. But ancient treatment of mental illness was not always compassionate or humane historically everywhere. Some societies believed psychosis resulted from demonic possession or dangerous supernatural contamination instead, universally. Those beliefs sometimes produced terrifying rituals attempting to remove evil spirits violently from sufferers. Isolation, restraints, and painful ceremonies became common responses towards severe psychological disturbances historically worldwide. One ancient surgical practice called trepanation involved drilling holes through living skulls frighteningly. Researchers believe trepanation attempted releasing evil spirits, supposedly causing mental illness and madness historically. Archaeologists discovered trepan skulls across multiple continents, dating back thousands of years, surprisingly worldwide. Many patients actually survived these brutal procedures, despite unimaginable physical pain and suffering afterward. The healed bone edges prove communities cared for patients during painful recoveries afterward compassionately. Even terrifying ancient rituals still involve someone remaining beside the suffering person compassionately afterward. Ancient Egypt recorded some of humanity's earliest written descriptions of mental illness historically ever. The Ebers Papyrus described confusion, despair, and emotional suffering medically, centuries before modern psychiatry. Egyptian healers recommended treatments instead of abandonment or violent punishment toward mentally suffering individuals. Some treatments combine medicine with structured conversation and emotional spiritual guidance compassionately for patients. Priests listened carefully while helping sufferers interpret their emotional and psychological experiences meaningfully together. Ancient Greece later transformed humanity's understanding of mental illness dramatically and permanently through philosophy. Greek physician Hippocrates argued mental illness came from the brain instead of demons entirely. That revolutionary idea appeared over 2,000 years before neuroscience could prove it scientifically. Hippocrates described conditions resembling depression, mania, and psychosis surprisingly accurately within ancient medical writings. He believed mentally ill people were sick, rather than spiritually cursed or possessed entirely. His recommended treatments included structure, exercise, healthy diet, and emotional stability for recovery. But Greek society still believed certain forms of madness carried divine spiritual meaning simultaneously. Philosopher Plato famously claimed divine madness exceeded ordinary human sanity and wisdom, sometimes spiritually. The Oracle of Delphi likely experienced altered psychological states during prophetic visions, regularly historically. Powerful rulers traveled enormous distances, seeking guidance from her mysterious fragmented prophecies and visions. What modern psychiatry labels psychosis sometimes became sacred authority within ancient Greek culture instead. Ancient Rome later created some of history's earliest organized mental care institutions for sufferers. Roman records describe dedicated healing spaces instead of prisons for mentally distressed individuals compassionately. These facilities represented early versions of hospitals, focused partly on psychiatric treatment historically already. But Roman society also feared mentally ill individuals and imposed strict legal limitations frequently. Guardianship laws treated some sufferers as incapable of managing their own lives independently legally. The tension between compassion and control has existed throughout human civilization constantly ever since. During the Middle Ages, mental illness became increasingly associated with demonic possession and evil. Religious authorities often believed madness resulted from supernatural spiritual corruption and dangerous evil forces. Exorcisms became common treatments for people experiencing severe psychological distress and psychosis historically. People suffering mental illness were sometimes beaten, restrained, isolated, or starved during treatment brutally. Many believed physical suffering could force evil spirits out from afflicted individuals during rituals. These violent methods often worsened psychological suffering, instead of helping mentally ill patients recover. Historical records reveal horrifying conditions endured by mentally ill individuals during medieval Europe repeatedly. But even within darkness, compassion still survived quietly inside certain religious communities across Europe. Monasteries sometimes operated early hospitals, offering shelter, food, and structure for suffering individuals compassionately. Religious caregivers believed every human remained sacred, despite mental suffering or psychological confusion entirely. The same ancient instinct to care continued surviving across centuries of fear and superstition. In 705 CE, Baghdad established the world's first dedicated psychiatric hospital, historically during Islamic civilization. Islamic medicine advanced mental health care, while much of Europe remained medically stagnant historically during medieval ages. Physicians carefully classified different mental illnesses and debated possible causes scientifically for centuries already. Famous physician Al-Razi argued mental illness originated from the brain medically rather than spiritually. He believed mentally ill people required doctors instead of priests or supernatural rituals for healing. His ideas echoed Hippocrates centuries earlier, despite widespread historical misunderstanding about madness and suffering. Europe eventually opened psychiatric hospitals centuries later, beginning slowly evolving approaches toward treatment historically. Valencia, Spain opened Europe's first psychiatric hospital officially during the early 15th century historically. But many later institutions became infamous for cruelty instead of compassionate healing and treatment historically. Bethlehem Royal Hospital became notorious as Bedlam, symbolizing chaos and psychological suffering historically throughout Europe. People actually paid money watching mentally ill patients as public entertainment disturbingly during history. Mental illness became spectacle rather than suffering deserving compassion, treatment, or dignity for centuries historically. Reformers eventually challenged these cruel systems and demanded humane psychiatric treatment passionately for sufferers. Philippe Pinel famously removed chains from psychiatric patients during revolutionary reforms in France historically. Dorothea Dix fought tirelessly improving mental health care conditions across America throughout the 19th century courageously. William Tuke promoted kindness, dignity, and emotional care instead of punishment towards psychiatric patients historically. These reformers believed mentally ill individuals deserved compassion instead of fear or public humiliation entirely. Their ideas reflected humanity's oldest instinct, caring for vulnerable people despite suffering and limitations compassionately. Yet modern society still struggles balancing freedom, treatment, safety, and psychological understanding compassionately for sufferers. Mental health care remains underfunded and heavily stigmatized across many countries worldwide even today, unfortunately. Many people still fear mental illness rather than understanding psychological suffering compassionately and scientifically today. The tension between compassion and fear still shapes mental health care policies worldwide continually throughout society. But archaeology reveals humanity's instinct to care existed long before civilization or organized religion historically. Even before writing, humans protected those unable to survive independently through collective compassion and support. That instinct appears older than temples, governments, laws, or even organized belief systems throughout history. The Iraqi skeleton survived because somebody chose compassion instead of abandoning weakness entirely during hardship. We do not know his name, beliefs, or exact personal story today anymore, but his bones reveal a profound truth about ancient human nature clearly through archaeology. Someone decided that suffering persons still mattered despite contributing little toward survival physically anymore. That choice may represent humanity's oldest known moral instinct, discovered archaeologically by researchers worldwide today. Compassion existed before nations, philosophies, sacred texts, or organized systems of morality and ethics. Humans repeatedly stayed beside suffering people, rather than abandoning them throughout difficult prehistoric history together. That instinct survived through ancient rituals, hospitals, monasteries, and psychiatric reforms across centuries continuously. The history of mental illness treatment reflects humanity's ongoing struggle between fear and empathy continuously. Sometimes societies responded with cruelty, while others responded through extraordinary acts of care compassionately. Modern humans still face many unresolved questions about mental suffering and ethical responsibility toward care. But the archaeological evidence proves compassion was never weakness throughout human evolutionary history, actually. Human civilization may have survived precisely because people cared for vulnerable individuals together, collectively always. We came from people who stayed beside suffering humans instead of abandoning them completely.